Thor's hammer, the weapon of a god, forged by legendary dwarves, wielded by the Aesir's greatest warrior, and feared across all the 9 realms. But here's the thing nobody talks about. MJÖLNIR was broken from the start. Not physically broken, though we'll get to that, but fundamentally flawed. A weapon that required raw, brutal force to compensate for what it lacked in design. A hammer that couldn't be controlled, only unleashed. And when you compare it to the Leviathan Axe, the weapon made for Kratos by the same dwarven brothers, the difference isn't just craftsmanship, it's philosophy. It's intent versus rage, precision versus destruction. Today, we're diving into the forge itself, into the myths, the canon, and the truth about why Mjölnir was never the perfect weapon everyone believed it to be. Let's start with what we know from actual Norse mythology, because God of War doesn't just pull from these stories, it reinterprets them. In the original myths, MJÖLNIR was forged by the dwarven brothers Brok and Sindri, also called Sindri in some tellings. Loki, being Loki, made a bet with them. He wagered his own head that they couldn't create treasures greater than those made by the sons of Ivaldi, another group of dwarven smiths. The brothers accepted. They forged 3 items: Gullinbursti, the golden boar; Draupnir, the self-replicating ring; and finally, MJÖLNIR. But here's where it gets interesting. During the forging of the hammer, Loki, disguised as a fly, bit Brok on the eyelid, trying to sabotage the process. The dwarf flinched. The bellows stopped for just a moment, and because of that interruption, MJÖLNIR's handle came out too short. The weapon was still powerful, unbreakable, always returning to Thor's hand, capable of leveling mountains. But it was flawed, imperfect, a weapon that could have been greater if not for interference. Now, God of War keeps the bones of this story, but it goes deeper. In this universe, Brok and Sindri, the same dwarven brothers, forge both MJÖLNIR and the Leviathan Axe. But here's the key difference. The hammer was made for Thor, and the axe was made for Loki, the just, Kratos' wife. 2 weapons, 2 wielders, 2 completely different purposes. And that difference, that's where everything unravels. Let's talk about what makes MJÖLNIR a flawed weapon, not just in myth, but in God of War's canon. First, the handle. It's too short. We see this clearly in God of War Ragnarök. Thor wields MJÖLNIR with a grip that barely fits both hands, and even then, he's often swinging it one-handed. That's not a choice born from strength, it's compensation. The hammer's balance is off. The short handle means the head carries all the weight, and controlling that in combat requires immense strength just to keep it stable. Contrast that with the Leviathan Axe. Its handle is perfectly proportioned, designed for 2-handed control or one-handed throws with equal efficiency. You can feel the difference in how Kratos wields it. It's an extension of his body, not a burden. Second, the instability. MJÖLNIR crackles with chaotic energy. We see it sparking, surging, barely contained. It's a weapon that demands to be used. It doesn't sit idle. It wants to destroy. That's why Thor can summon lightning storms, why every blow lands with thunder. But that power comes at a cost: control. The hammer doesn't respond to finesse, it responds to force. You don't guide MJÖLNIR. You aim it and hope for the best. Thor's fighting style reflects this perfectly: brutal, overwhelming, destructive. He doesn't fight with technique, he fights with violence. Because that's what the weapon allows. The Leviathan Axe, on the other hand, is precise. It freezes on impact. It returns on command. It can be thrown with surgical accuracy or wielded in close combat with fluidity. It's a weapon that rewards skill, not just strength. Third, the intent behind the forging. And this is where things get really interesting. Brok and Sindri didn't just forge weapons, they forged tools shaped by the wielder's nature. The Leviathan Axe was made for Loki, a giant who sought balance, protection, and justice. The axe embodies that. It's defensive as much as offensive. It's a weapon that can protect, that can be called back, that requires thought and intent with every swing. Kratos inherits this, and while he brings his own rage to the weapon, the axe itself tempers him. It makes him think. It makes him control. MJÖLNIR, though. MJÖLNIR was forged for Thor, the Aesir god of thunder, Odin's enforcer, the warrior who slaughtered giants not for justice, but for dominance. And the dwarves knew this. Whether consciously or not, they forged a weapon that matched Thor's nature, unstable, overwhelming, and built for destruction. Think about Mimir's words in Ragnarök. He calls Thor the worst of the lot. He describes him as Odin's tool of fear, a god so brutal that even other Aesir were wary of him. And what kind of weapon does a man like that need? Not one that requires discipline, not one that rewards restraint. He needs a hammer that channels his rage, that turns his anger into raw power. Mjolnir doesn't fix Thor's flaws, it amplifies them. And here's the kicker. The weapon failed Thor because it was never designed to help him grow. It was designed to make him effective, not better. The short handle, the chaotic energy, the dependence on brute force, it all locked Thor into a specific role. The destroyer, the monster, the weapon himself. Now let's talk about Brok and Sindri themselves, because their relationship with these weapons isn't just professional, it's personal. In Ragnarök, Sindri is clearly haunted by his past work. He's meticulous, obsessive, and deeply concerned with the consequences of what he creates. Brok, meanwhile, is more grounded, more accepting of the fact that weapons will be used for violence. But both of them carry the weight of MJÖLNIR'S legacy. When Kratos and Atreus first meet them, Sindri outright refuses to work on Mjolnir. He won't even touch it when Thor arrives. Why? Guilt. Disgust. Fear? Probably all three. Because Sindri knows what that weapon enabled. He knows how many giants died because of it. How much blood Thor spilled with the hammer he forged. And here's the tragedy. They didn't have a choice. The dwarves may be mastersmiths, but they're not free agents. Odin controlled them, threatened them, used them. Mjölnir wasn't a passion project. It was a commissioned tool of war, forged under duress. But the Leviathan Axe, that was theirs. That was a weapon they made willingly, for someone they respected. For Loki, a giantess who stood against Odin's tyranny. That's why the axe is perfect. That's why it's balanced, precise, and imbued with the kind of care that Mjölnir never received. Sindri's grief over Brok's death later in the game takes on a new meaning when you consider this. He's lost the one person who shared that guilt with him. The one person who understood what it meant to create something that would outlive its maker, and not always for good. So what happens when you pit Mjölnir against the Leviathan Axe? We get a glimpse of it early in Ragnarök, when Thor and Kratos clash. And here's what you notice. Thor relies on overwhelming power, while Kratos relies on control. Thor throws Mjölnir like a missile, calling down lightning, creating shockwaves. It's devastating. But it's also predictable. Once the hammer's been thrown, there's a split second where Thor's vulnerable, where he has to wait for it to return. And Kratos, with the axe, can capitalize on that. The Leviathan Axe freezes the air, counters the lightning, returns instantly on command. It's a weapon that adapts. And that fight ends in a stalemate, not because they're equally matched in strength, but because their weapons are evenly matched in philosophy. Rage versus intent, chaos versus precision. But here's the deeper question. What if Thor had been given the Leviathan Axe and Kratos had been given MjÖLNIR? Would Thor have learned restraint? Would he have become a protector instead of a destroyer? Or would the axe have been wasted on him, unable to temper a rage that went deeper than any weapon? And Kratos, could he have wielded Mjölnir without becoming the monster he once was? Or would the hammer's chaotic energy have dragged him back into the cycle of violence he spent years trying to escape? The weapons don't just reflect their wielders, they shape them. And that's why Mjölnir failed Thor, because it never asked him to be anything more than what Odin needed him to be. So let's bring it all together. Mjölnir didn't fail because it was weak. It failed because it was incomplete. A weapon forged under sabotage, wielded by a god who never learned to control his own power, and used as a tool of oppression rather than justice. The short handle, the chaotic energy, the dependence on brute force, were errors, weren't accidents. They were symptoms of a weapon that was never meant to elevate its wielder. Mjölnir was a cage disguised as a gift, a chain that bound Thor to his worst self. And the Leviathan Axe? It's proof that the dwarves could have made something better. That they did make something better when they were free to create with purpose instead of fear. Thor's tragedy isn't that he was a monster. It's that he was never given the tools to be anything else. Mjolnir was the weapon Odin wanted him to have, not the weapon Thor needed. And in the end, that's what makes the axe superior. Not because it's stronger, but because it was forged with love, not control. With hope, not fear. Kratos wields the Leviathan Axe not because he's worthy in the way. Thor was worthy of Mjolnir, but because he's willing to grow. And that's the difference between a weapon that traps you and a weapon that sets you free. And that's the story of Mimir, from Celtic fairy to Norse god of wisdom, from Odin's prisoner to Kratos' most trusted companion. It's a tale of ambition, tragedy, complicity, and ultimately redemption. It's one of the richest backstories in the God of War universe, and it's told so naturally, so subtly, that you might miss it if you're not paying attention. But that's what we do here at MythMode. We dig into these stories, we find the connections, and we explore what makes these games so much